win in Hamilton, now they are eyeing Auckland. The anti-fluoridation movement's mounted a PR campaign to convince people that fluoride is dangerous and ineffective. This is a highly emotive issue, with both pro and anti-campaigners claiming they've got the science to back their case. So who's right? In a moment, two dentists, two sides of the story. First, we asked the Health Minister if the government should be involved.
I don't think there's a role for central government in the decision making. That's a decision area for local communities. If anything, the Ministry of Health's responsibility is to make sure that people are informed of what the science says so that communities can make those decisions.
Do you think that message is getting through though, that the Ministry of Health is able to get that information to the people that need it?
Well, there's no doubt all the science points to the fact that there are benefits for families from fluoridation and that the levels of fluoridation are safe for New Zealanders. I think you've raised an interesting point though, is how successful have the authorities been in communicating those benefits to the communities. Now, clearly in the Hamilton situation, the evidence and the way that those arguments were presented didn't sufficiently sway the panel that they had in Hamilton. So one of the things I've done is I've asked the authorities to look at how they can better convey both the health benefits and the social benefits of fluoridation in such a way that people can appreciate those benefits and be aware of them. There are a number of referenda that are going to happen around the country over the run-up to the local body election period. I think communities need to be aware. There will be highly organised campaigns of misinformation. There will be people who come from out of town and tell all sorts of shock horror stories around fluoridation. Communities need to know that that's part of the strategy that these groups run, and they should look to their local district health boards, their local dentists, and the evidence which shows that fluoridation in New Zealand is safe and does benefit families.
Dentist Lawrie Brett of the Fluoride Action Network and Dr Jonathan Broadbent, a Senior Lecturer in Preventative and Restorative Dentistry at Otago University. A very good morning to you both. If I can start with you, Mr Brett, the Minister there is saying it was a highly organised campaign of misinformation. He's referring to your organisation on that.
Yes, well, I disagree entirely with that statement.
Well, you're highly organised, that bit's fair, isn't it?
Yes, well, it's a matter of having to be, of course. But misinformation, I think that's a bit beyond the pale, actually. I think there's a mountain of information to support our argument that fluoride is ineffective and dangerous.
All right, well, let's get to the dangerous side of it. What evidence do you have that it is a risk to people's health?
Well, research carried out over the last 50 years in regards to toxic effects on organs in the body. We have a brain effect, we have a pineal gland effect, thyroid absorption of iodine disruption, arthritic changes, calcifications of the major blood vessels, the list goes on and on and on. Actually, probably the most significant thing is that if you are giving fluorine in the water that you make up a baby's bottle with, the low weight of the baby means that the amount of fluorine that is being ingested is a toxic dose.
Dr Broadbent, do you accept any of these risks that we have just heard? Do you think there is any science to back that this is the case?
No, the science doesn't back those ideas at all. And if you consider the systematic reviews, the Ministry of Health position on this topic, you'll find that fluoridation is perfectly safe. It's in our water naturally anyway. All we do is adjust the levels.
So you're not accepting for babies, for example, there's any risk for them with their bottles?
No, that is in our guidelines on the use of fluoride. It says it's absolutely fine for use with babies. If parents are concerned, they can use unfluoridated water perfectly easily, that's fine.
And how old is the science? How long have you been studying the safety of fluoridated water?
Oh, the safety of fluoridated water, we've studied it for decades and decades, and all the science still points the same way, that it's safe and that it's effective. The anti-fluoridationists would have you believe that it causes all variety of different conditions when it doesn't cause those conditions. So as a Senior Lecturer in Preventive Dentistry, I strongly believe that the best filling that you can place is natural tooth. You know, if we can prevent tooth decay, we should be preventing tooth decay. And here we have a strategy, water fluoridation, that is effective at the population level. Everyone benefits. And so by delivering something like that, we can benefit the entire population and reduce inequalities.
There is science that shows lower tooth decay in areas where the water is fluoridated. But you don't buy that?
No, I don't buy that
Those studies,
at all.
I've read them, a lot of them.
Yeah, well, the latest figures for unfluoridated Canterbury areas show they have better teeth than fluoridated Otago and Southland. Timaru stopped fluoridating in 1983 and the expected epidemic of decay has not happened. Decay actually went down. There are two things about this too. Safety is mentioned here by Dr. Broadbent. The promoters of fluorine in water have never carried out a single safety test on that material. Never. Not one. And this is international. Secondly...
Well, I just need to get Dr. Broadbent to respond to that. There's never been a safety test on fluoride in water?
Plenty of safety tests, and there's many studies that have looked at fluoridation of the water. For example, there have been studies that have looked at the chemistry of artificially fluoridated water being very similar to natural fluoridated water. There are studies that have shown that, for example, the York review, which found that there were no toxic effects. It's a very safe public health measure.
Let's get on to the poorest hit, because that is one of the arguments, certainly, that children whose parents probably aren't buying the fluoridated toothpaste and doing all those things are the hardest hit, that if you take the fluoride out of the water.
Dr. Broadbent mentions the York review. The York review states clearly that there is no evidence for a particular benefit to the low socio-economic group. This is emotional propaganda on the promoter's part. In fact, the risk of damage from the fluorine is greater in the lower socio-economic group because the poison works more effectively if the person taking it is undernourished or unwell. And that's what the lower socio-economic groups represented as.
Dr. Broadbent, do you think there's any greater risk for lower socio-economic groups?
No, there's no greater risk. Fluoride is not a poison. And if you consider, for example, New Zealand research conducted more recently than the York review, there, for example, studies by Thompson and studies by Lee found that in fluoridated areas of New Zealand, the difference between rich and poor is smaller than the difference in unfluoridated areas. For example, then consider one of the biggest inequalities that we have, if you consider the results of our National Oral Health Survey conducted in 2009. There's big inequalities between areas that are fluoridated and areas that are unfluoridated. People from unfluoridated areas are disadvantaged.
Mr. Brett, if fluoride is a poison, why are they putting it in our toothpaste?
Good question. Not only are they putting it in the toothpaste, they're recommending to children that rather than rinsing your mouth out after you've brushed your teeth, you just spit it out and swallow the residue. And at 1,000 parts per million, that is a toxic dose for a young person. The other thing
but these are commercial enterprises who would, you know, if something were to go wrong, they would face really huge financial penalties, and it's in all the toothpaste brands. Well,
it's what is happening in America. There are lawsuits happening. One thing I think where we do have common ground on both sides of this argument is that since the late 1990s, we know now that the model of fluorine being ingested and absorbed into your teeth to strengthen them, that model has failed. It's wrong. It doesn't work that way. There is no benefit from ingesting fluorine.
In the water, you're saying, so you need to topically apply it?
Yeah.
Well, I'll get Dr. Broadbent to respond to that. No benefit in ingesting it in the water?
It's in the water, it's a fantastic public health measure because it reaches everybody, and it does reduce a burden of disease, and it does reduce inequalities. It does have a topical effect, yes, from drinking it, and you'll also find that there's fluoride in saliva as well following that. I think here we have a situation in New Zealand, if you consider what happened in Hamilton. The most concerning thing really is that here we have the Hamilton City Councillors that are taking the advice of the Fluoride Action Network, an organisation that's listed on Quackwatch, and they had something like 1,000 submissions from this organisation, which were pretty much just copy-paste jobs. And they're taking that advice over the advice of our own Ministry of Health. Now in New Zealand, our Ministry of Health is mandated to care for the health of our population. And our city councils, according to the Health Act 1956, they have the responsibility to improve the health of their populations where they can. And part of that, the Section 25, is by providing water supply. And fluoride's in the water supply anyway. It's everywhere. There's 200 to 300 parts per. Yeah. Oh yes, yes. And so all we're doing with fluoride, you know, the main source of fluoride is from fluoroapatite, a natural rock, which from which fluoride is produced and added to the water, and it's very effective at reducing inequalities and improving health.
Right, now I'm going to ask you both the same question to finish with. Mr. Brett, how can you look at the science, the same sort of science that Dr. Broadbent is looking at, and come up with such a different conclusion?
The evidence of modern research is that it doesn't work. The large-scale studies that are reviewed by the same York Review show a difference of about one surface of one tooth over a lifetime. The other thing too, if I may, to say that it's not poisonous is outrageous. It's the scrubbed remnants from the fertiliser works chimneys that is the fluoride source. That's a category 8 poison. And you could argue, and it's illegal to dispose of it into water and soil, you could argue that like in the case of the Auckland situation, they're putting 1,000 tonnes of that stuff a year into the Waitemata and Manukau harbours. That's arguably illegal. I don't know which is worse, that or the fact that Aucklanders, ratepayers are paying to drink 10 tonnes of it a year themselves.
Dr. Broadbent, I will ask you the same question I just asked Mr. Brett. How can you look at the same science, the same studies, and come up with such a different conclusion?
Well, I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Otago. We're encouraged to think critically, and I write scientific papers. I review scientific papers. I review for 20 different journals. And I know how to read a paper, a scientific paper. And I think that Mr. Brett here is perhaps a little out of touch with the science. He's a member of 2 different organisations that are listed on Quackwatch. You've got to be careful when believing information that's presented from people like Mr. Brett. The science is sound. The anti-fluoride groups will disregard information that doesn't suit them, and it's been going on for, 60 years. The anti-fluoride groups are following many of the same arguments that they have in the past, that you know, they'll say that fluoride has a toxic effect when it doesn't. You know, fluoridated toothpaste, fluoridated water, it's perfectly safe.
Thank you both for your time.
And it's very effective.
Thank you both for your time this morning, Mr. Brett and Dr. Jonathan Broadbent.